They say he sat at the center of a banquet of corpses, a long table stretched across a blood-soaked courtyard. Silver platters clattered in the wind. Wine goblets trembled atop rotting lace. The guests, noblemen, rivals, emissaries, all impaled days before, their bodies propped up in mock civility, arms draped over chairs, heads sagging, mouths frozen mid-scream. He raised a goblet, took a bite of meat, and smiled. He was not mad, he was not hungry, he was making a point. That in Wallachia, death was not a punishment, it was protocol. A world ruled by vultures needed a wolf in a crown, and so he crowned himself in blood. To some, he was a hero. To others, a monster stitched together from bone and flame. But all agreed on one thing: no one who met this man ever forgot him. He did not conquer with armies, he conquered with dread. A man who, as a boy, was traded like a coin and returned carved into a weapon. A prince whose law was etched in screams. A ruler who turned forests into graveyards and dared his enemies to walk through them. Tonight, we follow the shadow of a man whose name has outlived his body. A name soaked in terror, folklore, and the fog of centuries. A name whispered around campfires and carved into coffins. They called him Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon. Others called him devil, tyrant, madman. But he was none of those things. He was a man who had been caged as a boy and returned with teeth. A ruler who found no power in mercy, only obedience, only order, only the stake. This is not a legend, this is not superstition. This is the true story of Vlad the Impaler, the real-life Count Dracula. There are stories that begin with battles, with fire, with crowns. But this one begins with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that settles in a man's chest when he hands his children away. It was winter, 1442. The frost hung low in the valleys of Wallachia, and two boys, Vlad and Radu, rode beneath the weight of snow and betrayal. One was 11, the other 7. Neither spoke. They weren't prisoners, not exactly. They were hostages, but the polite kind, the diplomatic kind, the kind traded between empires like coin. Their father, Vlad Dracula, ruler of Wallachia, had made a bargain with the growing power to the south, the Ottomans. In exchange for keeping his throne, he gave them something more valuable than land or gold, his sons. And so the gates of Edirne opened and closed behind them. The Ottoman capital was a city of contradictions, a city of light and shadow. Marble domes rose into the sky like the backs of sleeping giants. Minarets pointed heavenward. Call to prayer echoed like song through narrow alleyways. To outsiders, it looked like paradise. But to two Wallachian boys who spoke no Turkish and trusted no one, it was a gilded prison. They were cleaned, dressed, given soft beds and hard lessons. Teachers instructed them in Arabic, Turkish, and Persian. They learned mathematics, poetry, law, the Quran. It was not kindness. It was conversion. The Ottomans had mastered the slow war, the kind where you did not need to conquer a people, only reshape them. First the tongue, then the thoughts, then the loyalty. For Radu, the younger, it worked. He smiled, adapted, learned quickly. His beauty was remarked upon in court whispers, his obedience rewarded with silk robes and sweets. But Vlad watched. He memorized faces, patterns, the guards' routes, the way courtiers bent their knees, not too deep, not too shallow. The weight of silence in a room before the Sultan entered. He was not soft, and so the palace gave him stone. They locked him in small rooms for insolence, gave him moldy bread when he refused to kneel, slapped him for speaking his native tongue. They did not beat him often, but when they did it to remind him, you are not yours anymore. Two boys entered Edirne as brothers, but over time, they became opposites. Radu was praised, favored, allowed to ride in parades beside Ottoman princes. The Sultan himself smiled when Radu entered a room. He converted to Islam, took on the name Radu Bey, and soon began to believe Edirne was not a prison, but a palace. Vlad, he did not convert. He did not bow unless forced. He did not laugh. He grew pale in the shadowed halls, lean, watchful. Where Radu bloomed, Vlad darkened. There are records, scribbled by foreign observers, of the change. One ambassador wrote, "The younger boy became beloved. The elder became something else." The Ottomans kept them close, but apart, not just physically, but emotionally. A deliberate split. Divide the heart, and loyalty dies quicker. Radu loved the court. Vlad learned to hate it in silence, but hate was not his only lesson. Vlad learned restraint, timing, symbol. He learned how the Sultan entered a room without speaking and left it changed. He studied the way fear operated, not as chaos, but as order. You could keep peace with kindness or with dread, and dread never needed sleep. He learned the value of masks, the danger of love, the price of mercy. He learned that a man is never truly free until he controls what others fear, and slowly, the boy that had once stared at Edirne's gates with terror began to smile. Not a happy smile, not warm, but thin, calculated, cold. The kind of smile that means, "I understand now." Outside the palace, the world was breaking. His father, the dragon, had fallen out of favor with the Hungarians, with the Ottomans, with his own people. Vlad Dracula was killed, ambushed. Some say it was his own nobles, others, a rival claimant. Either way, his body was left unburied. A message. His eldest son, Mircea, heir to the throne, was captured, blinded with hot irons, buried alive. Wallachia was a graveyard, a borderland caught between empires with no loyalty left to spend. And so, the Ottomans turned to their silent guest, Vlad, now 17, still unconverted, still unbroken, but useful. They gave him a retinue, a handful of soldiers, some gold, no army, no authority, and they sent him home. Wallachia greeted him not as a prince, but a shadow. The people remembered his name, not his face. The nobles remembered his father and what had happened to him. They called him a puppet, an Ottoman pawn. They bowed in court, but not in their hearts. Vlad did not argue, did not scream. He simply sat, quietly, and watched, because he had not returned to claim a throne. He had returned to take something far more dangerous. Memory. The same people who had buried his brother alive now kissed his hand. The same nobles who cursed his name now invited him to feasts. But Vlad was no longer a boy. He was a blueprint of terror yet to come. He had seen what fear could do in the Ottoman court. Now he would build something darker in Wallachia. They were still brothers, but no longer aligned. Radu now belonged to the court that caged them. His loyalty was polished, presented, praised. He had become Ottoman by faith, by name, by favor, and Vlad had become something else. He was not broken, not bitter. He was sharpening, slowly, quietly, watching the world and choosing where to cut it. They rarely spoke now. When they did, it was formal, empty, like strangers recalling a song they used to know. But the silence held more than distance. It held betrayal. For Radu, the palace was home. For Vlad, it was a forge. He remembered every lesson the Ottomans had taught him. How to rule through fear, how to silence disloyalty without lifting a sword, how to make pain into policy. And when he returned to Wallachia, he brought those lessons with him. The throne he claimed was fragile, provisional, a political favor from the very empire that had once imprisoned him. But Vlad did not sit like a guest. He sat like a man building something no one would dare take away again. He looked at the nobles who had killed his father and smiled. He met the eyes of generals who had buried his brother alive and nodded. He said nothing of revenge. He simply invited them to a feast. What happened next would become legend. But before the forests of the impaled, before the Ottoman Sultan himself would turn back at the sight of Vlad's handiwork, there was this moment. A young man on a stolen throne, eyes like frozen steel, voice soft, smile unblinking, and a single thought echoing behind his teeth. Never again. He had returned as a guest, but sat like a ruler. Vlad, no longer a boy, now occupied the throne his father once held, but the seat was still warm with betrayal. The nobles who bowed before him had buried his brother alive. The councillors who toasted his name had signed his father's death, and still, Vlad said nothing. He had learned from the Ottomans that words were often wasted. Symbols, however, lasted longer. So he planned a feast. It was Easter Sunday, 1457. Spring sun poured through cathedral glass, incense hung in the air, a celebration of resurrection. Vlad invited the boyars, Wallachia's noble families, every clan, every name, those who had betrayed his father, those who had stayed silent, those who had smiled while the dragon fell. They came, of course. They ate, they drank, they laughed. Vlad said little. He offered toasts, asked polite questions. Then, as the final course was cleared, he stood. He thanked them for coming, thanked them for their service, and then he had them surrounded. The doors closed, swords drawn. No one screamed, not yet, because it took a moment to understand what was happening. Then came the orders. The elderly were impaled on the spot. The younger nobles, dragged away, forced to march miles on foot, still in their finery, to the ruins of Ponari Castle. There, they were made to rebuild it, stone by stone, with their bare hands. Those who survived would live out the rest of their lives as servants. The rest became warning posts. The message was clear: you may kill a prince, but his son will bury you with the same hands you once kissed. This was not vengeance, not entirely. It was administration. Wallachia had long been a fractured land. Nobles ruled like kings. Farmers starved while aristocrats plotted. And every generation, some foreign crown claimed it as theirs. Vlad had learned in Edirne that stability could be built on pain. So he built. He cracked down on theft, corruption, treason. He restored trade routes, punished bribes with death, enforced justice through terror. The roads became safer because no one wanted to die screaming on a stake. Impalement became his signature, his law, his silence. Sometimes a single body, sometimes hundreds, always arranged carefully, like art. In one village, a thief was impaled with his stolen goods nailed to his chest. In another, a man was executed for not removing his hat in court. Vlad had it nailed to his skull. He did not explain these acts. He did not justify them. He simply ruled. There's a story often told in hushed tones about a golden goblet that sat beside a village well. It was left there for travelers to drink. No chain, no guard, just gleaming in the sun. And it remained untouched for years, because everyone knew what would happen if it went missing. Under Vlad, crime didn't vanish. It evaporated. To many, he was a savior, a leader who brought law to lawlessness. To others, he was a tyrant in red silk, a butcher with a crown. But to Vlad, he was neither. He was necessary. He had inherited a broken land, and where others planted flags, he planted fear, one stake at a time. Vlad did not rule from the castle alone. He ruled from the roads, the forests, the stake-lined fields that whispered in the wind. He visited villages without warning, listened to disputes, issued judgment on the spot, and sometimes he didn't speak at all. He simply pointed. Impalement was not just execution, it was performance. A body raised high above the earth for all to see, pierced from groin to mouth, left twitching for hours, sometimes days. He selected the stakes carefully, rounded tips, not sharp. A clean puncture wouldn't do. The body needed to settle slowly and die loudly. The sound of it traveled. Those who resisted him died. Those who obeyed lived quietly. Farmers kept their heads down. Merchants paid their taxes. Border towns once plagued by raiders began to thrive, not from joy, but from terror. And in his mind, this was justice, cruelty with purpose. We know Vlad's mind not just from rumor, but from his own hand. In letters to allies, Hungarian nobles, Transylvanian allies, he wrote of his methods plainly: no flourish, no apology. I have killed peasants, men and women, one letter reads, and impaled them. We cannot allow enemies to feel safe. He boasted of entire villages punished for harboring spies, of impalements that turned rivers red, of messages written in flesh. But to the people, he said little. He didn't need to. The stakes spoke for him. He wore the sigil of his father's old order, the dragon, stitched across his breast in blood red. But he was no longer a knight. He was something older, darker, something half legend already. Rumors swirled that he drank blood, that he dined among corpses, that he could not die. None of this was true, not yet, but Vlad never corrected them. In Wallachia, fear was the only law that never asked questions, so he became its prophet, and still he ruled. The roads stayed clean, trade increased. His castle at Panari stood rebuilt, stone by stone, its foundation held by the bones of dead nobles. He installed loyalists, sent enemies fleeing to Hungary. He had no parliament, no council, only obedience. Even the clergy, long corrupted by bribes and foreign influence, were forced to reckon with his wrath. Priests who preached defiance were silenced. Monks who housed dissent were buried beside it. He did not tolerate faith as armor, only as fear. But Vlad's cruelty wasn't just personal, it was geopolitical. Wallachia sat between giants, Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. For years it had bent whichever way the wind blew. But Vlad changed that. He refused tribute, refused to send men to serve the Sultan. He insulted emissaries, slit the throats of spies, sent severed heads back across the Danube in baskets of salt. The Ottomans were patient. But patience has limits. The forest had begun to grow, not of trees, but of stakes. And every stake told a story of a prince who ruled not with gold, but with silence, not with counsel, but with consequence. To many, he was a butcher, to others, a savior, but to history, he was something stranger, a man who learned power not from his throne, but from the cage he escaped. And soon, the world would come knocking, and find that Wallachia no longer opened its gates, it only opened graves. The Danube shimmered with summer heat. In the distance, the air trembled above the stones, and beyond it, waited the army of the Sultan. 150,000 men, janissaries, archers, engineers, mercenaries. The full weight of the Ottoman Empire, marching north across the river toward a land barely the size of a province. At their head, Mehmed II, the conqueror, the man who had taken Constantinople and now set his sights on Wallachia. And in their path stood Vlad. This was not a war of equals. Mehmed's army was vast, disciplined, armored in steel and gold. Vlad's was small, scarred, ill-equipped, a peasant levy backed by mercenaries and ghosts. But Vlad had never needed numbers. He had something else. He had fear. The Sultan crossed the Danube expecting resistance. Instead, he found nothing. Towns were burned, wells poisoned, fields scorched. The bridges collapsed behind his men. There were no soldiers to fight, no cities to seize, only ash and something worse. On the night of June 17th, 1462, Vlad struck. Under the cover of darkness, he led a band of riders deep into the Ottoman camp. Disguised in Turkish garb, speaking Turkish tongue, they slipped past sentries, past horses, past tents. Their goal, the Sultan's tent. It was an act of madness. But madness, in Vlad's hands, was strategy. Chaos erupted, torches fell, camels screamed, the sky caught fire as tents burned. They did not reach the Sultan, but they came close. Close enough for Mehmed to understand what kind of man he was facing. Not a soldier, not a noble, but something far older, a ruler with nothing left to lose and nothing left to prove. And then came the forest. On the road to Targoviste, the capital, the Ottomans saw it first, vultures circling low, the stench of rot. Then, through the haze, they saw the stakes, hundreds, thousands, stretching across fields, hilltops, along roadsides, each one crowned by a body, naked, mutilated, rotting in the sun. Men, women, Ottoman soldiers, Wallachian traitors, spies, servants, children. The Sultan's army stopped. It wasn't just the sight, it was the silence. Not a single word had to be spoken. This was not a battlefield. This was a message. If you continue, this is your future. Mehmed II, the man who took Constantinople, shattered kingdoms, built empires, looked upon the forest of the impaled, and turned around. It is said he vomited at the sight. It is said his men refused to advance. It is said the horses would not pass through. He left behind supplies, wounded men, and his reputation. Vlad had done what no army could do. He made death sacred. In the months that followed, no one was safe. Ottoman scouts were impaled at the border. Wallachian nobles were purged. Even foreign ambassadors were terrified to enter his court because the legend of the forest had spread, not as rumor, but as certainty. No one forgot the smell, no one forgot the stakes, and no one forgot the silence. This was Vlad's empire, an empire of fear, built not on conquest, but on memory, where a single road could change the course of history, where no grave was ever shallow enough. It was here, not in castles or novels, that Dracula was born, not as a vampire, but as a vision, the impaler prince who ruled with iron and rot, the lord of stakes, the architect of horror. He had no fangs, no cape, but the shadows followed him just the same. He did not drink blood. He spilled it methodically, monumentally, until it carved a kingdom of its own. And even as the forest of the impaled withered, his legend did not. There are rulers remembered for their victories. There are rulers remembered for their failures. But Vlad is remembered for his warning. He did not seek immortality, only to be understood. And the world has never stopped trying. This was not just a man. This was a message, one that speaks still, through trees that are no longer trees, and monuments made not of stone, but of bone. Word of the forest traveled fast. It passed from soldier to merchant, from priest to prince, from rumor to record, and by the time it reached the courts of Europe, the story had already grown claws. In Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, a king both ambitious and cautious, heard of the impalements with a shudder. To the Catholic Church, Vlad had once been a hero, a Christian bulwark against the Muslim tide. But now, he was something else. The Pope himself heard the reports. Ambassadors returned pale, some refusing to speak of what they'd seen. Church envoys debated whether Vlad was possessed, or if perhaps he was sent by God as punishment. A new word began to appear in letters, in sermons, in nightmares. Dracula, not son of the dragon, but son of the devil. And yet, the people of Wallachia stayed silent. They planted, they prayed, they paid their taxes, and they did not speak Vlad's name aloud after sunset. Because terror, once rooted, needs no gardener. It waters itself. Villagers lived in orderly fear. No theft, no rebellion, no whisper of treason. Even his soldiers, brutal men by trade, stood straighter in his presence. They obeyed quickly, spoke softly, did not ask questions, because they knew Vlad did not need a reason to impale you. He only needed an audience. Years later, travelers would claim the forest still stood, that the bones never vanished, that at dusk you could hear them creak in the wind, like trees groaning under the weight of memory. But the truth is, the forest was never meant to survive. It didn't need to. Its message had already been carved into history, into flesh, into folklore. Not just that Vlad had ruled with terror, but that terror itself could rule. There's a tale that survives from Vlad's reign. It's short, precise, brutal, which is why it has never been forgotten. A merchant arrived in court, foreign, confident, well-dressed. He approached the throne of Wallachia. He bowed. He offered tribute. He spoke with respect. But he did not remove his hat. Perhaps he thought himself above the customs of this land. Perhaps he forgot. Perhaps he was merely nervous. It didn't matter. Vlad did not speak. He only looked. And then he gave the order. 2 guards stepped forward. A third brought a thick iron spike. In silence, they held the man down and nailed the hat to his skull. Not a word, not a warning. Just the sound of iron entering bone. The man was released. Still breathing. Still conscious. The hat firmly, forever, part of him now. He was permitted to leave. And the court continued, as if nothing had happened. This wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't madness. It was theatre. The merchant had not just disrespected a prince. He had violated a ritual. And in Vlad's court, rituals were law. Rituals were structure. Rituals were survival. Remove your hat. Bow at the right angle. Speak when invited. Hold your eyes at the proper level. Smile, but not too much. Respond to praise with silence, never pride. These were not customs. They were commandments, and to break them was to invite spectacle. What made Vlad terrifying wasn't just his violence, it was his precision. The executions weren't random, they were orchestrated. Punishment was public, poetic, and often symbolic. A woman who neglected her chores was tied to a spinning wheel and left to die as it turned. A clerk who forged a tax record had his fingers removed and nailed to the document. A noble who whispered disloyalty after too much wine had his tongue removed, then placed in a goblet, delivered to his wife in court. Each act was a performance, not just a warning, but a lesson. The boyars, Wallachia's ancient nobles, were some of the richest men in the Balkans. They were used to power, intrigue, and backroom plots. But in Vlad's presence, they became statues. They sat in silence. They sweated into their silks. They answered only when addressed. They did not drink, did not shift in their chairs, did not even cough, because every movement could be read, and every misstep could become a story. One noble is said to have adjusted his robe during a tribunal. Vlad asked if he was cold. The man said yes. The next morning, he was found frozen, stripped and staked outside the palace gates. This obsession with control did not stop at court. It rippled outward into the villages, farms, and forests. Entire communities adjusted their behavior to align with what they thought Vlad wanted, even when they had no idea. Children were taught to speak only when asked. Elders blessed the wind before speaking of the prince. Farmers left offerings, bread, coins, even blood, at crossroads. A superstition grew that if you saw a raven land near your home at dusk, you must sleep outside that night, or Vlad's men would come. Did Vlad invent these rituals? Number. Did he encourage them? Number. But he did not stop them, because fear, once planted, grows best when watered by imagination. To outsiders, this all seemed insane, barbaric, pointless. But to Vlad, it was elegant. A court built on rules no one understood meant no one could cheat them. A system where guilt or innocence meant less than posture kept everyone aligned. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted performance, because when people live in fear, they become predictable. And when they become predictable, you can rule them. There's a recorded case of a man who stole a coin from a corpse. Vlad had the man caught, stripped, and laid across the very body he had looted. Then he ordered the man's skin flayed and used to wrap the corpse like a burial shroud. He said nothing during the execution, but afterward, he ordered that the body be left on the steps of a nearby church. The message was clear: even in death, my justice sees you. Over time, this fear became structure, routine, invisible architecture. Doors were opened more quietly. Horses walked more carefully through towns. Peasants learned to lower their voices, even among family. A man once spoke harshly to his wife during a market argument. The next day, his tongue was nailed to the village signpost. He wasn't executed. He was released, mute, so others could see what disobedience looked like in human form. But fear has a cost. Vlad's inner circle became a revolving door of servants, guards, advisors, many of whom vanished without trace. His court grew quieter, colder, more formal, more hollow. Even his allies began to drift away, unsure whether they were guests or sacrifices waiting for their cue. And yet the machine ran on, greased not with gold, but with blood. Vlad ruled not only with cruelty, but with intention. Every punishment was a statement, every execution a sermon. He was not content to kill, he needed it to echo. At first, the church saw Vlad as an ally, a Christian ruler holding the Ottomans at bay. But in time, the crosses turned cold, because Vlad's wrath did not stop at enemies. It extended to monks, priests, even bishops. He loathed corruption in the clergy, and to him, all clergy were corrupt. He once ordered a monastery of monks impaled, one by one, because they had prayed for peace while his men died in war. Another priest was sewn into his own cassock and burned alive after a sermon dared question Vlad's justice. He did not see this as heresy, he saw it as discipline, and for him, God lived closer to the whip than the psalm. Some of the most chilling records we have of Vlad come from letters he dictated himself, cold, methodical, unrepentant. To the Hungarian king, I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young, and impaled them. We cannot allow mercy to rot the bones of our kingdom. To a Transylvanian noble, I do not rule through love, I rule through truth. And the truth is, fear obeys longer. There is no rage in these letters, no madness, only clarity. Foreign envoys returned from Wallachia, changed. A German ambassador, upon returning home, refused to speak of Vlad for months. When asked, he simply said, "There is no metaphor in that land, only examples." Pamphlets began to circulate across Europe, stories of blood feasts, of Vlad dining among dying men, of fountains that ran red, of forests of the dead that moaned in the wind. Were they exaggerated? Yes. Were they true in spirit? Completely. Because Vlad had not just built a regime, he had built a myth. It's said that Vlad often watched his executions in silence, sitting beneath a canopy, sipping wine. He preferred impalement to be slow. He instructed his executioners to oil the stake, to make the tip rounded, not sharp, to angle it just enough that the body would not die too quickly. A good death, he said, could take 3 days. He believed this time, this in-between space of agony, was where fear lived longest, where it bloomed. In one infamous scene, he dined in a courtyard while dozens of men twitched on stakes around him. When asked why he tolerated the smell, he replied, "I do not dine with them. They dine with me." He impaled rebels. He impaled merchants. He impaled entire towns who resisted taxes. He impaled slow messengers, gossiping maids, and noblemen who laughed too loudly. And yet, crime fell to zero. Trade increased. The roads became safer than anywhere else in the region. Because in Vlad's world, even the shadows had ears, and even silence could be punished. Was he cruel by nature, or by necessity? Did he enjoy it, or was it the only tool he trusted? Historians debate this endlessly. Some say he was a sociopath, raised in chains, forged in paranoia, unfit for mercy. Others say he was a visionary, who understood the sick logic of power better than anyone else in his century. But one truth remains. He saw kindness as weakness. And in a world of wolves, he would rather be the flame than the sheep, long before fangs, capes, or coffins. The name Dracula already haunted Europe. Derived from Dracul, the dragon, it became in his time Dracula, meaning not just dragon, but devil. To his enemies, he was a horror. To his people, a curse. To history, something in between. He did not need to drink blood to be remembered in screams. He ruled not as a man, but as a warning. Every whisper of disobedience was met with a demonstration. Every smirk, a funeral. Every deviation from the ritual, a sermon of steel and stake. They called him monster, madman, savior, devil, Dracula. But titles do not matter when your name becomes fear itself. History tends to divide people into opposites, good or evil, savior or tyrant, brother or traitor. But in Wallachia, things were rarely so simple. The story of Vlad the Impaler cannot be told without his shadow, and that shadow had a name, Radu. In 1442, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire summoned a guest, not with flowers, not with treaties, but with an ultimatum. Wallachia's voivode, Vlad Dracul, was commanded to Constantinople. He could come willingly, or not at all. The price of peace was steep. 2 of his sons, as hostages, Vlad, the elder, cold-eyed, sharp-tongued, defiant, Radu, the younger, golden-haired, soft-featured, shy. 2 boys, 2 pawns, 2 futures, sealed behind iron gates. The court of Edirne was not merely a palace, it was a forge, where enemies became friends, where children became weapons. Radu adjusted quickly. He learned the language, he charmed the tutors. He prayed 5 times a day, not out of fear, but comfort. He was called Guzel Radu, Radu the Handsome, and soon the Sultan himself took notice. Silken robes replaced peasant rags, scented oils replaced cold baths. His name became an echo in hallways, followed by admiration. But Vlad refused to smile, refused to kneel, refused to forget who he was. He learned Arabic with clenched teeth. He memorized the Quran with contempt. He took to the blade, not for glory, but for survival. And when punished, he would not scream. They tried to break him, so they used hunger, isolation, whips. They showed him corpses of other boys who resisted, but Vlad did not yield. He watched, he waited, and he remembered. Every insult, every scar, every name, especially one, Radu. The brothers rarely spoke, not because they hated each other, but because there was nothing left to say. One had adapted, the other had calcified. At meals, Radu sat beside the Sultan. Vlad stood behind the guards. Radu spoke with lords. Vlad listened to rats. Their paths no longer crossed in flesh, but in the tension that filled every courtyard, every sparring match, every glance held too long. It was not rivalry, it was prophecy. By his teenage years, Radu had become a symbol in the Ottoman court, of possibility, of refinement, of conquest through charm. Poets wrote of him. Painters sketched his face with halos of gold. He was the Christian prince turned loyal son, the rose grown from Wallachian soil now perfumed with Turkish silk. Rumors whispered that Sultan Mehmed II adored him, not just as a soldier, but something more. Whether true or not, Radu's influence was unmatched. And Vlad, he became invisible. When their father, Vlad Dracula, was assassinated, chaos swept through Wallachia like wildfire. One son was gone. Another, Vladislav, claimed the throne. The Ottomans saw opportunity. They released Vlad, not with ceremony, not with blessings, but with a mission: return home, take the throne, serve the crescent. They expected another obedient pawn. What they unleashed was something else entirely. In 1448, Vlad returned to Wallachia for the first time in 7 years. His voice was deeper, his stare hollow, his hands trained to kill. The land did not welcome him, but it recognized him. He did not bring an army, he brought silence, a silence that spread, village to village, hall to hall. When he claimed the throne, few dared oppose him. They remembered his father, they feared what the Ottomans had made, and in his first week, 3 boyars were impaled. No trial, no tears. Back in Edirne, Radu watched the reports with disbelief. The brother he had grown beside was now called a butcher, a tyrant, a monster, a mad dog barking from a stolen throne. But Radu did not speak out, not yet, because even roses have thorns, and some brothers prefer to wait until they can crush you in bloom. Vlad had taken the throne through silence, fear, and fire. But thrones do not forget debts, and neither do sultans. When Vlad defied his Ottoman masters, stopped paying tribute, and executed envoys, he did not just offend, he declared war. The Ottomans would not be humiliated, and the Sultan already had a weapon prepared, a charming, golden-eyed weapon, who once shared Vlad's blood, and now carried his orders: Radu. It had been over a decade since Radu walked Wallachian soil. Now he returned, with 90,000 men, janissaries, Spahi cavalry, siege engineers, drums that shook the trees, banners that turned the sky green. He rode beneath the crescent moon, and he whispered peace. He sent letters to noble houses, to bishops, to peasants. He promised mercy, stability, a gentler hand, but he did not send one to Vlad. Vlad saw the invasion not as war, but as betrayal. His own blood now marched against him, blessed by the same empire that once caged them both. But Vlad would not meet him with negotiation. He met him with smoke. He burned his own villages, poisoned wells, slaughtered livestock, left towns empty and echoing. So when Radu's forces advanced, they found only ashes, no food, no prisoners, only silence and the smell of meat long dead. The people had vanished, or been taken for the stakes. June 1462. Vlad launched a midnight assault on Radu's encampment. Under moonlight, Wallachian riders stormed into Ottoman tents, slashing throats, setting fires, screaming false commands. Vlad led the charge himself. Target, the Sultan's tent. But Radu anticipated him. Mehmed escaped. The trap collapsed. Dozens died. Hundreds more fled. But Vlad had made his point. He would not die kneeling, not to an empire, and not to a brother. The people of Wallachia were torn. Radu offered clemency, Vlad offered control. Radu respected the church. Vlad threatened its altars. Radu smiled in parades. Vlad impaled in public squares. And though they feared the impaler, they were tired. Tired of death, tired of shadows, tired of watching neighbors disappear at night. So slowly, towns opened their gates. Not with joy, but with resignation. Radu's forces closed in. Boyars changed sides. Allies vanished. Vlad, once untouchable, became a fugitive. He fled north, seeking refuge in Hungary. But there, another betrayal waited. He was arrested, imprisoned, locked away by the very men who once called him protector of Christendom. No trial, no appeal, just silence. With Vlad gone, Radu was crowned prince, but he ruled like a shadow. He spoke softly, issued decrees, rebuilt towns. But the people did not love him. They obeyed him, because even after Vlad was gone, his legend lingered in the fields, in the empty gallows, in the nightmares. Radu ruled for 5 years. Then he died, alone, in a plague camp. There were no songs, no monuments, only a name, mostly forgotten. The war between Vlad and Radu was not fought for victory. It was for memory. One chose elegance, the other terror. But in the end, both were consumed by the empire that shaped them, by the land that bled for them, by each other. 2 brothers, 2 paths, 1 curse. In 1462, Vlad Dracula was a prince. By winter, he was a prisoner, not taken by his enemies, but by his saviors. He was betrayed by kings, silenced by popes, forgotten by allies. And yet, the world never stopped whispering his name. After Radu's conquest, Vlad fled north toward Hungary, seeking protection from a man he once called friend, King Matthias Corvinus, the same king who had praised Vlad as a Christian hero, the same who had begged him to hold the southern border against the Ottoman tide. But Hungary had changed, and so had its priorities. Vlad arrived with blood on his hands, and rumors in the air, rumors that he was unstable, godless, uncontrollable. The boyars, many of whom had fled to Hungary during Vlad's reign, whispered poison into the court, and so Matthias had him arrested. No trial, no verdict, just silence. Vlad was imprisoned in Visegrad Castle, perched high above the Danube River, its walls thick with thyme and moss. The cell was narrow, the ceiling low, the light almost myth. No records tell us precisely how he was kept. Some say he was chained to a wall for over a decade. Others claim he lived in relative comfort, reading scripture, feeding crows. But all agree on one thing: he did not speak. For years, he did not speak. Wallachia forgot him. Radu died soon after taking the throne. Other princes came and went like storms. Ottoman-backed, paper-thin. The boyars ruled in fragments. Peasants suffered in silence. The land wept. But no one asked for Vlad. Not out of relief, but out of fear that summoning his name might bring him back. His throne rotted, his enemies aged, and in a cell in Hungary, the man they called Impaler waited. While his body sat in chains, his legend slipped free. In Germany, pamphlets appeared. The Prince of Blood drinks with the dying. He impales mothers and children together. He roasts his enemies alive and eats their hearts. The stories became stranger, hungrier, almost gleeful, and they sold. Because fear sells better than gold. And Vlad had become the coin. What did Vlad think locked behind stone? What did he dream? Some say he went mad, others that he found religion. He was known to read the Bible obsessively. He memorized the Psalms. He took up the sign of the cross. But faith alone doesn't explain the silence. It was as if Vlad knew that legends grow best in darkness. The quieter he became, the louder the world filled in the blanks. One guard reported that a single black crow came to perch outside Vlad's window every morning. It stared at him. He stared back. They never moved. They never blinked. When the guard asked what it meant, Vlad reportedly whispered, "It's the only one still watching." Then he returned to silence. Most prisoners rot. Vlad fermented. He did not protest, did not beg, did not curse. He waited, because unlike kings, legends are patient. Time breaks most men, but it only hardened him. Vlad Dracula, the Impaler, the Devil, the Wallachian tyrant, had vanished behind stone walls for over a decade, and in that silence, something strange happened. He became more powerful. The guards at Visegrad began telling stories. They swore the prisoner rarely slept. They'd find him sitting upright, eyes open, unmoving. Some claimed they heard him recite entire passages of scripture in the dead of night, his voice low, as if in argument with something unseen. Others found birds dead outside his window, always with their wings broken, neatly arranged. Once, a soldier claimed he saw Vlad weeping, but when he returned with others, the cell was empty and the chains still warm. In 1472, a Franciscan friar was permitted to visit the prisoner. He brought bread, wine, a cross. He later wrote, "The man I met was not as they say. He was not wild nor demonic. He was composed, cold, curious." They spoke for hours. Vlad asked questions about politics, geography, but never about family. When the monk tried to steer the conversation to forgiveness, Vlad reportedly smiled and said, "God forgives. I remember." The monk never returned. Only one letter from Vlad's imprisonment survives. It is addressed to the Hungarian court, written in elegant Latin, free of rage yet brimming with purpose. He declares himself innocent. He invokes his service against the Ottomans. He pleads not for freedom, but for a chance to serve again. "I have not changed," he writes. "I have only paused." It is the kind of letter you expect from a diplomat, but you read it like a warning. While Vlad rusted in silence, the world shifted. The Ottomans tightened their grip on the Balkans. Wallachia became a revolving door of puppet rulers. The boyars grew fatter. The people grew poorer. The roads, once clean under Vlad's terror, were now littered with bandits, and whispers began to circulate. We were safer when the devil ruled. Peasants told tales of the forests speaking, that the impaled still swayed in dreams, that one day the crow would caw again, and he would return. In Europe, Vlad's legend exploded. Woodcuts showed him dining beneath twitching corpses. German printers nicknamed him Dracula, the dragon's son, and soon, the devil's kin. He was blamed for everything: plagues, storms, stillbirths. Folk tales twisted him into a demon who rose at night, drank blood, and cursed the living. There was no boundary now between man and myth, and behind his cell, Vlad said nothing, because he didn't have to. In 1475, something cracked. Stephen the Great, ruler of neighboring Moldavia and longtime enemy of the Ottomans, petitioned for Vlad's release. The timing was no accident. Ottoman power was surging, the Balkans were burning, and Europe needed someone who didn't fear the dark, a man who knew Ottoman tactics, who understood terror, who could lead without kindness. They needed Vlad. So, after over a decade of silence, the door opened. He emerged thinner, older, his beard grey at the edges, but his eyes were unchanged. He walked like a statue being reanimated, spoke like a knife being unsheathed. The world had softened. He had not. When asked if he had changed in captivity, Vlad simply said, "I have not changed. Only the world has." Most prisoners are forgotten, but Vlad was remembered too much. He left no heirloom, no legacy of laws, only echoes. But in those echoes, he waited, and the world finally called him back. Vlad the Impaler vanished from the world in chains, and when he returned, he did not knock. No army, no parade, no coronation, just a man walking out of myth, and once again, toward the throne. In the winter of 1475, Wallachia was burning. Bandits controlled the roads. Boyars traded loyalties like currency. The Ottomans had installed another puppet ruler, Basarab Lyota, loyal in name, corrupt in deed. Stephen the Great, ruler of Moldavia and longtime thorn in the Sultan's side, had seen enough. He wrote a letter. He summoned an old friend, or perhaps an old monster. And from a cold Hungarian fortress, Vlad Dracula stepped forward. Not as a ghost, not as a hero, but as the devil they needed. The world had not seen him in 12 years. Gone was the youthful fire. His beard was streaked with grey, his voice lower, stripped of fire and pride. But something worse had taken root. stillness. He didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't flinch at the sound of gallows creaking, didn't blink at whispers of what he once was. He moved through courts like a statue, and kings held their breath. Because no one truly knew what Vlad had become, only that he was here, and he wanted back what was his. Stephen met him in Suceava, not with celebration, but in silence. They walked alone for an hour in the snow, no guards, no interpreters. What was said has never been recorded, but when they returned, Stephen announced, "Wallachia will rise, and he will ride." Within a week, Vlad was crowned once more, the exiled prince, now reborn. But there were no cheering crowds, no bells, just a land holding its breath. Vlad returned to Târgoviște, the former capital, in December. The gates creaked, windows shut, dogs barked but did not approach. The castle had decayed. Weeds grew through the flagstones. The throne room smelled of mildew and blood. He ordered no repairs, only a table, a chair, and a new courtyard for stakes. On his second day, Vlad summoned the surviving boyars, those who had sworn loyalty to his enemies. He asked only one question: "What do you fear more, me or the Sultan?" They stammered. One bowed, another begged. Vlad nodded, and by dusk 7 were impaled. He did not justify, he did not smile, he simply began. Peasants began to speak again, not loudly, but with dread. He returned in winter. That means he doesn't plan to plant, he plans to bury. He was dead once. He came back angry. Even his horse won't neigh anymore. They did not resist him, but they did not celebrate. He was not a king. He was a punishment. Venetian diplomats wrote in panic. German pamphlets resurrected his name. One wrote, "The Wallachian returns, and stakes bloom like spring flowers." In Buda, King Matthias offered no comment, but his men rode to the border, just in case. The Ottomans, furious at his release, plotted retaliation. But Vlad didn't seem to care. He had no interest in politics, only in control. By the end of January, the fields outside Târgoviște were filled again. Not with wheat, but with reminders, stakes, precise, evenly spaced, each with a single corpse, not hundreds, not thousands, only what was needed, to remind the people he had returned, and so had the silence. Most rulers come back seeking redemption. Vlad came back seeking order, not peace, not justice, just silence. Because in silence, you can hear footsteps, you can hear betrayal, you can hear legends echoing their way back home. When Vlad returned to power, there was no celebration, no cheers, no riot of gold or feast. There was only winter and a throne too cold to remember warmth. This was the reign of the dead king walking. He reoccupied the palace at Târgoviște, but it no longer echoed with advisors, jesters, or visiting nobles. He dismissed the courtiers. He dined alone. He issued no public addresses. Messages were passed by scribes. Edicts nailed to doors at dawn. One read simply, "Lie once, die once." Another, "Fear is not a sin, but it must be useful." Unlike his first reign, Vlad no longer needed grand spectacles. There were no great forests of stakes, no feasts beside twitching corpses. This time, the executions were surgical. One noble beheaded in the square at dawn, another found hanging by his own belt in his manor. A tax collector disappeared, later found stuffed in a wine barrel. Each death carried no trial, no announcement, only message. "I see you." Peasants whispered that Târgoviște had changed. Children cried less. Dogs stopped barking. Even birds avoided rooftops. Markets opened late and closed early. Church bells rang softer. One merchant wrote, "It is as though the city breathes once a day and holds it the rest." At night, Vlad would walk the streets alone, disguised only by his silence. He listened to deals made in alleys, to whispers behind doors. He returned home, and those names vanished. He created a network not of spies, but of watchers, old women, children, blind men. He called them the still eyes, their only payment to keep breathing. Every Monday, he washed his hands in freezing water before dawn. Every Tuesday, he fed the dogs himself. Every Friday, he sat in the chapel, unmoving, until the last candle burned out. No one knew why. No one asked. One monk claimed Vlad had begun speaking to shadows. Another said he wept when the chapel rats gnawed through his boots and left him untouched. In the royal archives, 4 unsent letters were found centuries later, none dated, none addressed. Each was written in the same hand. Steady, perfect. I have returned, but the throne is not the same. It shivers beneath me. The people blink too quickly. They remember. I see it in their shoulders. I keep a mirror in the cellar. It will not show my eyes. They will not let me die. I must do it myself, but slowly. The ink is brown, the paper chewed by mice, but the message is clear. A priest from Cluj visited unannounced. He found Vlad in his study. The prince did not rise. The priest asked if he would consider leniency, mercy in rulership. Vlad stared at the candle between them, and after a long pause he said, "I tried mercy." And they set fire to the house. The priest left in silence. By the next day, he had fallen ill and died. By spring, the signs appeared. 3 bodies crucified on the bridge. A shepherd's staff split in half and nailed to the church doors. A crow's wing buried in salt beneath the market square. The old women whispered, "He is marking endings." His soldiers grew anxious. Even his captains feared to speak first. They say Vlad would sit at the edge of the banquet table and just listen, not to the music, not to the words, but to the silence between them. He was no longer hunting traitors. He was waiting for something. Some kings grow cruel with power. Vlad grew cold with time. The boy who once screamed in the dungeons of Edirne was gone. So was the man who burned villages to the ground. What remained was silence wearing skin, a ruler with nothing left to prove, and no one left to trust. The throne had become a grave, and he, its last whisper. Vlad ruled Wallachia again, but the land no longer bent, it bristled. He had returned with silence, but silence cannot hold against war. By late 1476, the Ottomans were coming back, and Vlad knew he would not sit the throne again. He would ride, one last time, and the road would not return. Sultan Mehmed II had not forgotten, the man who impaled his soldiers, who dined among corpses, who humiliated his empire with fire and ice, now restored in Wallachia. Vlad was a threat, an aging one, but a dangerous one. In November, Ottoman loyalists and Wallachian defectors pushed north. They sacked small towns, set churches ablaze, cut open grain silos and salted the fields. It wasn't a conquest, it was a warning. Vlad responded the only way he knew. He marched. He gathered 2,000 soldiers, mostly peasants, some Moldavians, a handful of hardened captains. He dressed in black, his horse, white, no crest, no banner. He carried no standard, only a long iron-tipped spear. They called it the Iron Column, and it moved with eerie quiet. Every morning, Vlad rode at the front, silent, expressionless. Every night, he walked the perimeter of camp, alone, looking for movement, listening for lies. Near the Argesh River, it happened. A band of Wallachian nobles, those who had sworn loyalty days before, vanished overnight. They reappeared at the rear, blades drawn. Half the army turned, half held fast. Vlad did not retreat. He ordered his captains to split, form a V formation, and charge. He rode into the center, and when it broke, he was nowhere to be seen. His horse returned, bloodied, empty. For 3 days they searched the forest. No body, no armor, no sign, only a pool of blood, a broken spear, and a single raven feather in the mud. By the 4th day, the Ottoman banner flew over Târgoviște again. They claimed Vlad was dead. Hungary said nothing. Moldavia remained silent. The people of Wallachia, they just stopped speaking his name. One account claims his head was found and sent to Constantinople, preserved in honey, presented to Mehmed II. The Sultan looked at it for a long time, then said nothing. He ordered it displayed on a pike outside the city gates. For 3 days, the crows refused to touch it. By the 4th day, it was gone. Vlad's body has never been found. Some say he was buried beneath a monastery, others that he was tossed in the river. A few claim he escaped, disguised, wounded, silent. A Romanian shepherd, decades later, claimed he saw a man in royal garb tending sheep in silence, with a scar through his neck. No one believed him, but he never retracted the story. What followed was confusion. Letters arrived from the east claiming Vlad lived. Others said he'd become a monk. Some claimed his soul had entered a wolf. In the years that followed, villages still found bodies on stakes. No one claimed them. Church bells rang at odd hours. Children whispered his name into mirrors. Vlad is not dead. Vlad waits in the fog. Vlad rides when the crow caws 3 times. And then, silence again. A king dies once, a tyrant dies many times. But Vlad the Impaler, he never really died at all. He became something older, darker, unfinished. Not a man, not even a memory, but a place in the mind you do not touch. Vlad Dracula was gone, his body vanished, his kingdom dissolved, his bloodline extinguished, but his head, they say, remained, displayed for 3 days, watched, whispered to, feared, and then nothing, not decay, not rot, just disappearance. And from that absence, a shape formed, a figure, a face, not Vlad, something older, something worse. Dracula. The first accounts were crude woodcuts, printed in Germany and Venice. They showed a man feasting beneath impaled corpses, children boiled alive, merchants nailed to walls. In these pages, he was called Vladislaus der Impaler, Dracula Vida, Voivode of Blood. One pamphlet from 1499 claimed he impaled women for baking bread too early. He punished liars by removing their tongues with fire. He salted the earth where betrayal occurred. The stories spread faster than fire, and far longer. Somewhere along the way, Vlad's image began to shift. He stopped being just cruel. He became unnatural. A traveler from Saxony wrote, "We passed a ruined fort. Locals called it the Devil's Door. They said his ghost rides there at night, dragging chains of bone." A Hungarian priest described him as neither dead nor fully alive, a walker in mist. Villagers left cloves of garlic at their windows, slept with coins under their tongues, not to ward off spirits, but to confuse the dead prince should he return. The Orthodox Church buried his name in silence. The Catholic Church denounced him in whispers, but both feared what had been let loose, because Vlad's story was not about politics, it was about control, and the hunger to make the world obey. His methods were remembered not as strategy, but sacrament, a dark mirror of divine punishment. Where God asked for mercy, Dracula demanded silence. In 1897, Bram Stoker published a novel. Its villain, a Transylvanian count, ancient and undead, cunning, cruel, thirsty. His name? Dracula. Stoker borrowed the name from history books, but the soul of the character, his hunger, solitude, tyranny, felt too perfect to be coincidence. He transformed Vlad's iron cruelty into eternal thirst, and the world never looked away again. In Romania, his image is split, a patriot, a monster, a prince who protected his people through horror. Children read his story in schoolbooks. Tourists visit his castles. Historians debate what he really did. Folklorists debate what he became. But no one denies this. Vlad ruled not just with swords, but with symbols. He weaponized fear. He made cruelty an institution. And when he died, he gave that weapon to history. Even now, some say you can feel him. In the forests where stakes once stood. In ruins where moss grows red. In silences that fall too quickly. He does not whisper. He watches, not to haunt, but to remind that obedience is not love, that terror leaves fingerprints, that somewhere in the thinnest veil between fact and nightmare, Dracula still waits. Not all kings build empires. Some carve absences. Not all monsters are born. Some are remembered into being. And not all ghosts linger for revenge. Some linger for reverence. Vlad Dracula is dead, but Dracula, he is history's refusal to forget. Vlad the Impaler died in the mud, no grave, no monument, no final prayer. He was a ruler forgotten on purpose, a nightmare folded quietly into the archives. But silence is never permanent. It deepens, it hardens, it starts to whisper, and through that silence, something began to breathe again. When the winter of 1476 faded into spring, Wallachia had a new ruler. The Ottomans returned. Stephen of Moldavia returned to his borders. Hungary moved on. No poems were written for Vlad, no sermons held, no mass said for his soul. His few surviving supporters quietly removed his insignias. His surviving enemies praised his death with too much relief. And then the world closed the book, but only for a moment. A curious thing happened in the years after Vlad's death. German printing presses, new, fast, and hungry for scandal, began to publish strange pamphlets. They didn't tell of wars, or policies, or treaties. They told of horrors, of stakes rising like forests, of feasts held beside twitching corpses, of kings who drank blood and vanished into fog. The figure at the center was always the same, sometimes called Vlad, sometimes Dracula, often the voivode of blood. The truth twisted quickly. In one version, Vlad impales thousands at once, their screams like music. In another, he blinds an entire village for failing to greet him with candles. In yet another, he tricks an Ottoman envoy into kneeling by removing the floorboards beneath him. Each tale worse than the last, each more unbelievable, and yet each read like a warning, not just of a man, but of what men can become when left to rule the dark. The word Dracula reappeared too. Not just in Wallachia, but in Poland, Saxony, even Rome. It wasn't said aloud, it was written, scratched into wood, burned into staves. One monk wrote, "They call him Dracula, not for the dragon, but for the thirst." The line between man and monster had begun to melt, and a new shape was taking form. One scholar in Vienna attempted to organize the accounts. He catalogued 112 tales of Vlad's brutality, but on the last page of his ledger, he wrote in Latin, "These stories do not align, but they all say the same thing. He was feared not for what he did, but for what he could become again." That ledger was later burned by the Habsburg court. No explanation given. But the myth had already escaped. In the Carpathian villages, Vlad's name lived in other forms. Old women told children not to lie, or the silent prince will find you. Fathers nailed iron nails to their doorframes in case the rider returns. The impaler became the punisher became a figure of justice, and justice blurred into nightmare. One peasant tale told of a man whose shadow walked away from him after speaking Vlad's name at midnight. Another claimed that wolves refused to cross trails where his horses once trod. In the decades after his death, 3 men claimed to be Vlad returned. One wore a silver mask and said nothing. One appeared before a fire in the woods and vanished with the smoke. One walked into a monastery, wept at the altar, and bled from the eyes. Each time, the local village collapsed into terror. Crops failed, dogs howled through the night, priests abandoned their posts. None of these men survived more than a week. All died with one word on their lips: forgive. Modern historians call it the silence gap, a 40-year window where no official records of Vlad Dracula were written, and yet his name grew louder. No one admits to writing the pamphlets. No court claims authorship of the woodcuts. And yet they're everywhere. Why? Because silence invites fiction, and fiction is where tyrants go to live forever. A man died, and in his place, a crypt opened. Inside, fear. Inside, fascination. Inside, something waiting to be named. History abhors a vacuum, and when Vlad disappeared, the world filled it not with mourning, but with myth. The silence after Vlad's death did not last. It simply shifted. Where the chroniclers ended their records, the storytellers picked up the thread, and what they spun was no longer history. It was hunger, darkness, desire. Dracula had died. Now, he would be reborn. By the 18th century, the name Dracula had begun appearing not in ledgers, but in fiction. Hungarian poets romanticized him. German ghost stories turned him into a cursed revenant. Russian folktales renamed him the Pale Count. One Czech ballad tells of a knight who duels the devil and wins, but becomes Dracula in exchange. What began as propaganda and fear matured into legend, then into literature, because Vlad wasn't just a man anymore. He was a shape, a mask, a mirror. In the early 1800s, Europe entered a new age of horror, plague, poverty, panic. The Romantic movement turned fear into beauty and death into poetry. Writers like Byron, Polidori, and Mary Shelley gave life to the monsters of mind and flesh. But the vampire was still formless. It would take one man to give it a body, a name, a castle. Bram Stoker. Published in 1897, Dracula was a phenomenon. It introduced Count Dracula as a nobleman of ancient evil, elegant, unnatural, impossible to kill. He does not just drink blood, he steals will, destroys identity, unmans kings, and seduces queens. In a letter, Stoker wrote, "I took the essence of an old warlord and gave him deathlessness. Let him roam the dark corners of the modern mind." He did not name Vlad in the text, but his research notes reference Voivode Dracula repeatedly, underlined twice. Stoker's Dracula was not just a vampire. He was everything Europe feared at the fin de siècle: foreign invasion, sexual corruption, ancient faiths reawakening, the collapse of rationality. He was the embodiment of what could not be explained and what would not stay buried, and he was based, however loosely, on Vlad, which made him real enough to hurt. The brilliance of Dracula was his shapelessness. He could be anything, anyone, an aristocrat in a crumbling castle, a wolf in the woods, a bat on your windowsill. He was fear that adapted. Where Vlad used stakes and silence, Dracula used fog, charm, seduction, and where Vlad ruled with brutality, Dracula ruled with presence, not a tyrant, a virus. In the 20th century, Dracula escaped even the page. He took the stage, then the screen. In 1922, Nosferatu portrayed him as a plague, bald, rat-like, inhuman. In 1931, Bela Lugosi gave him grace, poise, and a voice like velvet. In 1958, Christopher Lee made him animalistic, regal, and ravenous. In 1992, Gary Oldman made him tragic, a lover cursed by war, each portrayal different, each rooted in the same ancestral soil. Vlad, Dracula endured because he was not one story. He was all stories of fear, condensed, sharpened, the fear of death, of outsiders, of seduction, of madness. He could enter any age and adapt. In Cold War cinema, he was communism with a cape. In the AIDS era, he was infection made flesh. In the digital age, he became algorithmic, a meme of mortality. And yet, always he returned to the same castle, to the same coffin, to the same name. In all of this, where was Vlad, behind the fangs, behind the cape, behind the curtain, a real man, forgotten, yet always there, in the castle silhouette, in the name whispered before the cut, in the chill before sleep? He was not the vampire, he was the shadow that gave it shape. Fiction may lie, but myth reveals. What began with stakes in the ground ended in ink on a page. Vlad died, Dracula was born, but they share the same eyes. Not watching, waiting. Dracula is not real, that's what we tell ourselves. He's fiction, a character, a fable of blood and loneliness. But if he's not real, why is he still here? Why does he return in every era, every war, every screen, every fear? Because Dracula was never meant to die. And neither was Vlad. He was made to echo. Most monsters have an era. Frankenstein belonged to science, Jekyll to repression, the Mummy to empire. But Dracula has no expiration. He shifts with culture, feeds on new fears, and survives every stake. In every decade, he finds new skin. Modern cinema gave Dracula new teeth, from the surreal dream Dracula of Coppola, to the military strategist Dracula of Netflix's Castlevania, to the romantic anti-hero of countless YA novels. He's a rock star, a CEO, a warlord, a lover. He doesn't even need fangs anymore, just influence, power, control. Where Vlad used fear to enforce obedience, Dracula uses allure to seduce submission. In Romania, Vlad is still debated. Was he a tyrant or the last good ruler? Statues rise, tourism blooms, politicians invoke him with pride or warning. In 2014, a party leader said, "We need another Dracula, not the vampire, the man who punished corruption." In an age of instability, many would rather live under a monster they understand, than a chaos they don't. Dracula becomes the strongman, the guardian, the punisher of liars. Why do we fear Dracula? Because he is not like us? Or because he is exactly like us, with nothing holding him back? He represents isolation, control, immortality without warmth. He cannot love. He cannot trust. He can only take. He is what power becomes when it no longer answers to anything. And Vlad, he showed us that form of power once existed, in flesh. Dracula is the dream. Vlad was the proof. Every time someone picks up Dracula, they bring him back. Every actor who dons the cape resurrects him. Every meme, every movie, every Halloween. The echo deepens. Because Dracula is not a story. He is a pattern, a loop in the human mind that asks, what if power lived forever? What if cruelty never rotted? What if fear became elegant? And what if we liked it? Visit the ruins of Panari Castle. Listen to the wind scrape the stone. You'll hear nothing. But the locals still leave offerings, still whisper his name, still close their shutters early in winter. He does not walk anymore, they say. But the walls remember. Because history may decay, but myth is built to last. And Dracula was made, not to live, but to return. Some monsters are born, others are built, and a few are invited. Dracula did not rise from the grave. We called him, with fear, with fascination, with longing, and every time we say his name, we remind the dark we are still listening.